We'll look in a bit more detail at ionic bonds. So ions are charged particles. They are created when an atom or molecule gains or loses electrons. Gaining electrons creates a negatively charged ion, and losing electrons creates a positively charged ion. Now, positive ions are also called cations, and they're usually created when an atom or molecule loses electrons. Positive ions are also called cations, and the metals in group 1 and group 2 of the periodic table can easily lose electrons to become positively charged ions. Now, negative ions can also be called anions, and they are usually created when an atom or molecule gains electrons. And negative atoms, as I mentioned already, are also called anions, and non-metals in group 7 are the elements that are most likely to gain electrons to fill up their electron shell and become negatively charged. Now, ions can also contain multiple elements. So, for example, SO4 is an ion and it's got a 2 negative charge. So you can have the single element with a charge. So, for example, fluorine is F minus, or you can have that SO4, a group of elements with a 2 minus charge. So just to recap some of that, ions are charged particles that form when an atom or molecule either loses or gains electrons. Ions are either positive or negative. Remember, positive ions are created when an atom loses electrons, and the metals in group 1 and group 2 of the periodic table are most likely to become positively charged. Now, metals in group 1 have 1 electron in their outer shell. So when they form positive ions, they lose 1 electron to empty their outer shell. Group 2 metals have 2 electrons in their outer shell. So when they form positive ions, they lose 2 electrons to empty their outer shell. And for negative ions, they're created when an atom or molecule gains electrons. The non-metals in group 7 are most likely to gain electrons and become negatively charged. And for those group 7 non-metals, they have 7 electrons in their outer shell. So when they form negative ions, they gain 1 electron to complete their outer shell. So, calcium is in group 2 of the periodic table. What happens to calcium, to a calcium atom when it becomes an ion? Well, what happens is the calcium, because the calcium is in group 2, and it's a metal, there are 2 electrons in its outer shell. Calcium atoms remove these 2 electrons to achieve a full outer shell containing 8 electrons in total. And in doing this, it becomes a Ca2+ ion. Now, a bit more information about ionic bonding. When atoms form ions, they try and fill up or empty their outer shell electron. In ionic bonding, a metal atom transfers electrons to a non-metal atom, allowing both of them, the non-metal and the metal, to have a full outer shell. So group 1 metals always lose 1 electron to form positive ions with the charge of +1. So, for example, sodium has the electronic structure 281, and that loses its outer electron when forming an ion to make Na+. Now, group 2 metals always lose 2 electrons, and they form a doubly positive ion. So, for example, magnesium, when that becomes an ion, the electronic structure of the atom is 282, and it loses both of those 2 outer electrons and forms an Mg2+ ion. Now, for non-metals in groups, say 6 or 7, non-metal atoms always gain electrons to form negative ions. So, for example, fluorine is in group 7 and has the electronic structure 2,7, and that will gain an electron to form an ion, which will be F-. Now, noble gases, they're the elements in group 0 of the periodic table, and they already have a full outer shell of electron. And because of that, noble gases are very unreactive and don't normally form ionic bonds with other elements. So let's recap some of that. Group 1 metals always lose one electron to form a single positive ion. That's, for example, Na, an Na atom, sodium atom, has the electronic structure 281, and an Na plus ion has the electronic structure 28. And group 1 metals form positive ions with a single positive charge. Group 2 metals form positive ions with a double positive charge. Group 6 non-metals form negative ions with a double negative charge. Group 7 non-metals form negative ions with a single negative charge. And noble gases not usually involved in ionic bonding. So, those two types of ion again. Remember, the negatively charged ions formed by gaining electrons are called anions, and the positively charged ions formed by losing electrons are called cations. How does the nucleus of an atom change when it gains electrons? So in terms of the nucleus, what happens is it actually doesn't change at all. So it's just the outer shells that change. The nucleus doesn't change at all. Materials with ionic bonds usually always conduct electricity. Only conduct electricity when they're molten or dissolved, and they have high melting points. When atoms form ions, they try to fill up and empty their outer electron shell. And for noble gases, they already have a full outer electron shell, so most ionic bonds that we see don't involve noble gases.